My name is Margaret, but people call me Maggie. I spent most of my life pouring every ounce of love, sweat, and sacrifice into raising my daughter. She was my pride, my joy, the very reason I woke up every morning. I thought when her wedding day came, I'd finally get to see all those years of sacrifice bloom into a moment of shared happiness. But the invitation never came. I waited day after day, checking the mail like a foolish child, only to discover through a distant cousin that my daughter had deliberately chosen not to invite me. Not an oversight, not a mistake, an intentional erasure. The humiliation stung deeper than any wound. The daughter I raised alone had locked me out of her happiest moment. Stay with me, honey, because what I did next shocked everyone, and you'll want to hear it. Before we continue, tell me, where are you watching from today? Drop it in the comments. If stories like this one resonate with you, hit subscribe. I never expected life to be easy, but I always believed that love and determination could make up for what we lacked in money or prestige. When my husband walked out before our daughter could even say her first word, I decided I wouldn't crumble. I worked double shifts, cleaned offices late at night, and carried groceries for neighbors just to scrape together enough for rent. Every blister, every sleepless night, every tear I shed in silence, I told myself it was worth it, because it was all for her. She was the light of my life. I remember rocking her to sleep in a secondhand chair, whispering promises about the future. I didn't have much, but I had imagination, and I wanted her to dream bigger than I ever could. At bedtime, I would make up stories about princesses who didn't wait for a prince to save them, but who built kingdoms with their own hands. Her giggles would fill the room, and she'd beg for one more story, Mama, just one more. There were mornings when we had only toast with sugar sprinkled on top because payday was still 2 days away, yet she looked at me as if I had given her the world. On weekends, we baked cookies together, and the smell of chocolate chips melting in the oven became our version of luxury. When she learned to ride her bike, I ran beside her until my lungs burned, cheering louder than any parent on the street. Those memories are stitched into my soul like patches on a worn quilt. One of my most treasured possessions was an old photo album. It wasn't fancy, just a leather-bound book I bought at a yard sale. Inside, I placed every photograph of her milestones, birthdays with homemade cakes, report cards with gold stars, and snapshots of silly faces she made at the kitchen table. But tucked between those everyday pages was something more special. We had glued in magazine cutouts of dream weddings, lace gowns, flower arches, glittering rings. When she was little, she'd sit with me and point to the pictures, saying, "When I get married, Mama, you'll be right there next to me." I clung to those words like a promise written in stone. But as she grew older, things began to shift. At first, it was subtle. She started borrowing makeup tips from girls at school and sighing at the thrift store dresses I picked out for her. "They're fine, Mama," she'd say, but her tone carried a quiet edge, as if fine wasn't enough. I brushed it off as teenage moodiness. After all, every girl wants to carve her own path, right? Then she went off to college on scholarships and part-time jobs. I couldn't have been prouder. I stood at her graduation in a simple dress I'd altered myself, clapping so hard my hands stung, tears blurring my vision as she crossed the stage. She barely glanced at me in the crowd, but I told myself it was nerves, that she was overwhelmed by the moment. The real change came when she met him, her fiancé. He came from a wealthy family, the kind of people who host dinner parties where the forks outnumber the guests. At first, I was excited for her. She deserved happiness, but soon I noticed her voice softening when she introduced me, almost like she was embarrassed. At one dinner, his mother asked me casually what I did for a living. I told her proudly that I managed a small cleaning service I had built from scratch. The look that crossed her face, pity disguised as politeness, stabbed me in the chest. My daughter's cheeks flushed red, and she quickly changed the subject. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, realizing that maybe in her new world, I was becoming a shadow she wanted to hide. Conversations became shorter. Phone calls less frequent. When I tried to talk about wedding dreams, the ones we used to share while flipping through that photo album, she dismissed me with, "Oh, Mama, things are different now." Weddings cost money, you wouldn't understand. I laughed it off at the time, pretending it didn't sting, but inside, something fragile cracked. One afternoon, she came home with a box of invitations. My heart leapt, thinking she'd sit at the kitchen table like old times, letting me help seal the envelopes. Instead, she tucked them under her arm and said she was late for an appointment. I noticed how carefully she kept the box angled away from me. I didn't think much of it then, but later, when I learned the truth, I realized that was the beginning of my erasure. Even the way she dressed began to change. She traded the bright floral skirts she used to love for sleek, expensive styles that seemed to drain the color out of her. I watched her slip into that world of glittering surfaces and whispered judgments, and every time she laughed a little too hard at their jokes, I wondered if she was laughing at me too. I wanted to tell her that love isn't measured in fine china or pedigrees, that real strength is built on loyalty and sacrifice. But the words stuck in my throat. I feared that if I said them, I would push her even further away, so I smiled. I smiled at dinners where I felt invisible. I smiled when she rolled her eyes at my thrifted shoes. I smiled when she introduced me simply as Margaret, never my mother who raised me alone. And I told myself that once the wedding came, all of it would be worth it, that she'd look for me in the crowd and I'd be there, the constant presence in her life. What I didn't know was that the crowd she imagined had no place for me. The first whispers of her wedding came not from her lips, but from the mouths of others. I was walking through the market one Saturday when an old neighbor leaned over the pile of apples I was weighing and said, "Congratulations. I hear your daughter's wedding will be the event of the year." My hands trembled so badly that an apple slipped from my grasp and rolled across the floor. I forced a smile, pretending I already knew. In truth, I hadn't heard a word from her. Soon, news spread like wildfire. Relatives began boasting about their invitations, their outfits, their travel plans. My sister phoned me, gushing about how beautiful the embossed card was, how she was planning to buy a new gown just for the occasion. I sat on the edge of my bed, the phone pressed to my ear, nodding and humming as if I, too, had held the card in my hands. When she asked, "So what did you think of the design?" I lied and said it was lovely. After we hung up, I searched the mailbox again, even checked under the welcome mat, foolishly hoping an invitation had been misplaced. The box was empty. Days passed. I told myself it was a mistake, that maybe she had given mine directly to me and I'd simply forgotten. But deep inside, I knew the truth. Each time another cousin called to brag about seating charts or menu choices, my heart cracked a little more. How could the woman I raised, the girl who once swore I would stand beside her on the biggest day of her life, cast me aside as if I were nothing? Finally, I couldn't hold it in any longer. One evening, I called her. My voice shook as I asked, "Sweetheart, I've been hearing from everyone about your wedding, but I haven't gotten my invitation yet." There was a pause, a heavy silence that seemed to stretch forever. Then she sighed. "Mama, I didn't send you one." For a moment, I couldn't even process her words. "Didn't send me one," I repeated, hoping she would laugh and say it was a terrible joke. But she didn't laugh. Her voice was cold, clipped. "It's complicated. His family thinks it's better this way. I don't want any drama on my wedding day." My throat closed. "Drama? Since when did my presence become drama?" "Mama, please don't make this harder than it already is," she said sharply. "This is my day, and I need everything to be perfect. You wouldn't fit in with the kind of people coming." The words stabbed deeper than any knife. I had been reduced to a blemish, an embarrassment she wanted to hide from the polished guests who would fill her banquet hall. "I raised you," I whispered, but she was already pulling away. "I know, and I'm grateful," she said quickly, her tone dismissive. "But things are different now. I need you to understand." She didn't wait for me to answer. The line went dead. I sat in silence, the hum of the disconnected call filling my ear until the phone slipped from my hand onto the floor. That night, I opened the photo album we had built together, the one filled with clippings of lace gowns and bouquets. Her handwriting scrawled in childish letters across one page, "Me and Mama on my wedding day." My tears blurred the ink until the words bled into the paper. I thought of all the sacrifices, all the nights I stayed awake to pay bills, the days I skipped meals so she could eat. I thought of the promises we once shared, spoken in whispers beneath starry skies, of the little girl who used to cling to my arm and say, "I'll never leave you, Mama." Now she had not only left me, she had erased me. The betrayal was no longer a suspicion, no longer a fear whispered in the dark. It was real, it was sharp, and it was final. After that phone call, I carried myself through the days like a ghost. At church, I took my usual place near the back pew, hoping the hymns would soothe me, but instead they cut sharper than ever. Between verses, I heard the murmurs. Two women in front of me whispered about how grand the wedding would be, how the reception hall was already draped in roses and crystal chandeliers. One of them leaned closer and said, "I heard her mother isn't even invited." "Imagine that!" the other gasped. They glanced over their shoulders, saw me sitting there, and quickly lowered their voices. But I had already heard. The following week, at a family gathering, the whispers grew louder. My cousins passed around photos of the bridal shower, everyone beaming in coordinated pastel dresses. I sat at the edge of the room, unnoticed, listening as my own relatives speculated why I wasn't included. "Well, you know how his family is," one aunt muttered, sipping her tea. "They probably think she doesn't measure up." Another added, "Can you blame the girl for wanting something classier?" The words pierced me, but I kept my face composed. Years of enduring hardship had taught me how to wear a mask. Everywhere I turned, pieces of the truth revealed themselves like shards of glass. I heard the same story again and again. Her fiancé's family didn't approve of me. To them, I was too plain, too ordinary. I didn't belong in their polished circle, their world of money and status. They wanted a flawless picture, and I ruined the frame. One evening, unable to sleep, I pulled the photo album from the shelf again. Its leather cover was cracked at the edges, worn soft from years of turning pages. I set it on the kitchen table and opened it slowly, tracing my finger along the photographs. There she was as a toddler, frosting smeared across her cheeks from her second birthday cake. There she was at 12, grinning with braces, holding a soccer trophy half her size. Then the page I dreaded most, the wedding clippings we had pasted together. A little girl's handwriting spelled out, "Mama will sit in the front row." I pressed the album to my chest, as if I could hold the past tightly enough to stop it from slipping through my fingers. But when I looked around my quiet kitchen, all I saw was absence. The invitations that filled everyone else's mailboxes had bypassed mine. The conversations about centerpieces and playlists happened in rooms where I wasn't welcome. My name had been scrubbed from the story of her life like chalk wiped from a board. The realization settled heavy in my stomach. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't forgetfulness. I had been intentionally erased. She hadn't just failed to invite me, she had rewritten her own narrative to exclude me entirely. Still, I couldn't let go. I found myself lingering in places where scraps of information floated through the air. At the grocery store, I overheard a pair of women debating whether the gown was custom-made or imported from Italy. At the post office, I caught a man bragging that his niece was on the guest list for the rehearsal dinner, and each time, I stood silently, invisible, my heart pounding with the knowledge that the world was celebrating an event I was forbidden to touch. At another family dinner, one of my nephews mentioned the seating chart. "They'd got the table set up like royalty," he chuckled. "His family at the front, everyone else behind. It's going to be the kind of wedding you read about in magazines." His eyes flicked toward me for a second, then away, as if ashamed to meet my gaze. In that instant, I knew he knew the truth too, that I had been cast aside deliberately, and no one dared say it aloud. I excused myself early that night, claiming I wasn't feeling well. When I returned home, I opened the album again. The photographs stared back at me, frozen pieces of a life where I mattered. I thought about the bedtime promises, the whispered dreams of a little girl who once said, "Mama, you'll always be there." The cruel contrast between then and now burned like fire in my chest. The tension twisted tighter with every passing day. The world was moving forward, the wedding growing closer, and I remained outside the circle, a shadow lurking just beyond the light. My absence had become a decision, a design, a choice carved into stone. And yet, through the pain, a spark of defiance flickered. If they wanted to erase me from the story, they would have to try harder. Because I was still here, I still had a voice. And I still carried the one thing no one could take from me, the truth of who I was, and the proof of it in every photograph pressed into that worn leather book. The final blow didn't come from my daughter's lips, but from the mouth of someone who thought they were making casual conversation. I was at the grocery store, standing in line behind a woman who knew my cousin. She turned, cheerful and unaware, and said, "Isn't it wonderful that your niece found such a fine young man? And to think, she's managed all this on her own, with no parents to guide her." Her words struck like a thunderclap. I froze, the basket slipping from my hand. "No parents?" I asked quietly, my voice trembling. She smiled kindly, as though explaining something obvious. "That's what she told everyone. Poor thing, raised herself, built her life from nothing. Such a strong, independent girl." I nodded numbly, but inside, the world caved in. No parents. She hadn't just excluded me, she had erased me entirely, rewritten her story to cast me as dead, invisible, never existing. All those years of sacrifices, the sleepless nights, the double shifts, the birthday cakes baked from scratch, vanished with a single lie. When I got home, I pulled the photo album onto the table once again. I turned page after page, the photographs blurring through my tears. There I was, standing beside her in a paper cap at kindergarten graduation. There I was, clapping as she twirled in her prom dress, bought secondhand, but altered with my own hands. And yet now she told the world she had no parents. My presence in her life had been reduced to a phantom. The pain burrowed deeper than before. It wasn't just shame, it was denial. To her new circle, she wanted to appear as someone who rose from nothing, untouched by the woman who raised her. I felt stripped of my very identity as a mother. But with the agony came something sharper clarity. If this was the story she wanted to tell, then I had a choice, to fade quietly into the background or to remind her and everyone else that I was very much alive. The humiliation hardened into resolve. She might have erased me from her narrative, but she couldn't rewrite the truth that lived in me, in my memories, in the album I refused to let go of. Still, to the world outside, it looked final. Everyone believed her version, that she had no parents, that she had climbed into this glamorous life on her own. It was easier to believe that than to ask why the woman who had given her everything wasn't standing beside her on the happiest day of her life. I pressed my palm against the album, whispering into the silence, "You can deny me to them, but you'll never deny me to yourself." The words steadied me even as my heart shattered again. For the audience watching, it seemed as though my daughter had fully rejected me, trading her past for a future built on lies. And maybe that's what she thought too. But deep down, I knew the truth had a way of resurfacing, no matter how carefully buried. The days ticked closer to the wedding, and everywhere I turned, someone was talking about it. At church, at the market, even in the park where I took my morning walks, conversations floated past me like arrows dipped in salt. "They're bringing in a string quartet all the way from New York," one woman gushed. "And the cake 5 tiers, with real gold leaf on the frosting," another whispered with awe. I kept my head down, but the words seeped in, burning my chest. Each detail painted a picture of a wedding designed to impress, a spectacle to flaunt the wealth of her fiancé's family. I imagined chandeliers glittering, crystal glasses clinking, waiters carrying trays of champagne, all the things my daughter used to tell me she didn't care about. "It's not about the party, Mom," she had once said while flipping through bridal magazines. "It's about the love." But now, apparently, it was about the show. Relatives didn't bother to hide their smirks when they spoke to me. Some wore faces of pity, the kind that sting worse than cruelty. "It must be hard for you, Maggie," one aunt said with false sweetness. "But you understand, don't you?" These things are complicated. Complicated. That word wrapped around me like a snake. My absence wasn't complicated. It was intentional. My daughter had erased me, and the family went along with it, choosing comfort over confrontation. I returned home one evening to find the invitation in my cousin's hand. She waved it carelessly, a shimmering envelope with my daughter's new monogram embossed in gold. She didn't offer to show me the details, but I glimpsed enough: The ballroom at the country club, the dress code, the ornate script. That envelope should have been mine too. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the photo album once more. There was a picture of us laughing in the backyard, frosting on our noses after baking cookies. Another of me sitting cross-legged on the floor, reading her The Velveteen Rabbit while she leaned against my arm, half asleep. Those images were my proof, my evidence that I had existed in her life. And yet, in the new story she told, I was invisible. That night, I cried until my eyes burned. But when the tears dried, something inside me shifted. The humiliation had reached its peak. The rejection was final, and in the silence of my living room, I whispered to myself, if I can't be at her wedding, then I'll create my own celebration. The thought startled me at first, but it didn't fade. It grew stronger with every passing hour. Why should I sit home, hidden and shamed, while they waltzed beneath chandeliers? Why should I let her narrative of erasure define me? I was alive. I was her mother. I had a story too, and I would not be silenced. I began to imagine it, a gathering not of wealth and pretense, but of authenticity. A celebration of survival, resilience, and dignity. I thought of inviting neighbors, old friends, even a few family members who still whispered their support when no one else was listening. I imagined music, laughter, the kind that came from the heart, not from polished orchestras. And then the idea sharpened into something bold. What if I hosted my party right next door to her wedding? Not hidden away, not tucked into the shadows, but close enough that the sounds of joy would spill over the walls and remind her that I existed. The decision electrified me. I hadn't felt this alive in years. I pulled out a notebook and began scribbling lists, food, music, decorations. I didn't have their wealth, but I had community. I had friends who remembered my sacrifices, people who had watched me work 2 jobs, who had shared coffee with me at midnight when I was exhausted. These people would come, not for spectacle, but for love. The more I planned, the more my resolve hardened. Every whispered insult, every pitying look from relatives, every smug boast about the wedding became fuel. They wanted me erased. They wanted me silent. Instead, I would throw a party they couldn't ignore. I booked the old hall at the community center conveniently, just steps away from the country club. The caretaker, a kind man named Bill, agreed to let me decorate however I wanted. I called in favors from neighbors. Mrs. Jenkins offered to bake pies. My friend Clara insisted on stringing lights she had kept from her son's graduation. It wouldn't be grand, but it would be real. I pictured tables filled with homemade dishes, children running under twinkling lights, music spilling from speakers borrowed from the church. No gold leaf frosting, no chandeliers, but joy, pure and unashamed. The whispers continued around town. She's not invited, poor thing. Can you believe it? Such a shame. And with every word I smiled a little more to myself. They thought I was defeated. They thought I was crushed, but soon they'd see. Soon, they'd hear the music from my hall mixing with the violin strings from the country club. They'd see 2 celebrations standing side by side, one dripping with wealth, the other glowing with truth. And in that moment, my daughter would know I hadn't vanished. I would not beg for a seat at her table. I would build my own. The morning of her wedding dawned bright, the kind of crisp blue sky that painters try to capture but never quite get right. I woke before the sun, nerves and adrenaline buzzing through me like I was a bride myself. My hands shook as I carried boxes into the community hall, but my heart was steady. Today wasn't about hiding anymore. By 8 o'clock, Clara and Mrs. Bran Jenkins were already waiting for me, their arms full of streamers and pie tins. Together we strung lights across the ceiling beams, hung paper lanterns that swayed gently in the breeze, and tied balloons to every chair. It wasn't polished, it wasn't perfect, but as the colors filled the room, it felt alive. Children from the neighborhood ran in and out, laughing as they helped scatter confetti across the floor. Someone started playing music on the speakers we borrowed from the church youth group, and soon the room was pulsing with warmth. On the far table, I placed the photo album. I opened it to the very first page, my daughter as a toddler in pigtails, grinning at the camera with cookie dough smeared across her cheeks. As the pages flipped, they told the story of her childhood, every moment of love stitched into photographs. There she was at her 5th birthday, blowing out candles. There she was at prom, smiling nervously in a dress we had picked out together at a thrift store. And there were the pages of bridal magazines she had once clipped and pasted in, circled with childish handwriting, "My dream wedding." That album became the centerpiece of my party, glowing with fairy lights around it like a shrine to the bond we once shared. Guests stopped to flip through it, their eyes softening as they remembered. Outside, cars rolled into the country club parking lot. From the windows of our hall, we could see the limousines and designer dresses flowing toward the ballroom. The air was thick with tension, two worlds standing side by side, separated by a few hundred feet but miles apart in spirit. And then something happened I never expected. As our music began to swell, a few curious relatives wandered over from the country club. They had slipped out during the cocktail hour, drawn by the laughter spilling from our hall. One by one, they peeked inside, their jeweled dresses glimmering under our string lights. Some gasped softly at the sight of the album, their hands covering their mouths. A few even stayed, choosing pie and laughter over champagne flutes and stiff smiles. The contrast became undeniable. On one side, chandeliers, crystal, and a suffocating air of perfection. On the other, joy, imperfection, and memory. I didn't expect her to come. God knows, I thought my daughter would stay locked inside that ballroom, wrapped in silk and wealth, blind to what was happening a stone's throw away. But as the night wore on, a hush fell over our guests. Whispers spread like sparks. "She's here." I turned toward the doorway and my heart nearly stopped. My daughter stood there, her wedding gown trailing behind her, diamonds glittering against her skin. But her face, oh, her face wasn't triumphant. It was lost, trembling, caught between worlds. Behind her, one of the bridesmaids hissed her name, urging her back. But she didn't move. She stepped forward, her eyes darting to the music, to the laughter, and finally, to the photo album. Her hand reached out, almost instinctively, brushing the page where she was 5 years old, frosting on her nose. Tears welled in her eyes. Gasps erupted from the doorway as the fiancé's family appeared, horrified. The groom's mother clutched her pearls, demanding she return at once. Guests from the country club crowded behind them, their perfect illusion cracking as the bride. My daughter stood frozen in a room that felt more like home than the ballroom ever could. I walked forward, my knees trembling but my voice steady. For years I had been silent, humiliated, erased. "But not now, sweetheart," I said softly, my voice carrying in the hushed room. "You may have denied me today, but I'll never deny that you are my child." The words hung in the air, thick with truth. My daughter's lips trembled, her chest rising and falling as tears spilled down her cheeks. She looked at me, really looked at me, as though seeing me for the first time in years. Behind her, the fiancé's father hissed, "This is unacceptable." "You're embarrassing yourself." But my daughter didn't turn to him. She stayed rooted, her hand still resting on the photo album. The truth was too powerful to ignore. The glamour of the country club, the gilded wedding, the designer dress, all of it cracked in that moment under the weight of memory. She remembered who had held her hand during fevers, who had cheered in the loudest voice at every graduation, who had whispered bedtime stories until she fell asleep. The room pulsed with silence. My guests waited, holding their breath. Relatives who had mocked me stared, shame flickering across their faces. Even the children seemed to sense the shift, their laughter fading into wide-eyed wonder. Then my daughter whispered, almost too softly to hear, "Mom." It was just one word, but it carried a lifetime. The fiancé's family sputtered, trying to pull her back. But she stepped deeper into the hall, her gown brushing against the confetti-strewn floor. She didn't care that her dress might stain, that her makeup was streaked with tears. She was drawn not to chandeliers, but to the glow of string lights and the comfort of her own story. In that moment, the glamorous illusion shattered. The wedding next door might continue, but its centerpiece, the bride, was no longer theirs to control. She had crossed the threshold into truth, and nothing would ever look the same again. I reached out my hand, not to claim her, not to force her choice, but to remind her that I was still here. Always here. And as she took one hesitant step closer, the hall erupted into whispers, gasps, and finally applause. Not for wealth, not for spectacle, but for the courage to face what mattered. That night, two parties stood side by side, but only one carried the heart of a mother and a daughter rediscovering what could never be erased. Whispers swirled like smoke the moment my daughter crossed the threshold into our hall. Faces turned, lips pressed together, eyes narrowed in judgment. Some guests whispered cruel things. Imagine rejecting your own mother, while others shook their heads at me as though I'd somehow forced this collision. But I didn't flinch. I stood with my chin lifted, watching the scene unfold. The fiancé's family hovered at the door, red-faced and indignant. The groom himself appeared, his jaw clenched, his eyes darting between his bride and me. He reached for her arm, but she pulled away, her shoulders trembling. And then came the moment no one could have scripted. The ballroom emptied. Guests spilled out into the courtyard, their murmurs spreading like wildfire. Some returned to their cars, shaking their heads at the scandal. Others stood frozen, caught between two celebrations, unsure where loyalty should lie. The perfect facade of their grand wedding was collapsing under the weight of truth. The fiancé's mother hissed, "You've humiliated us." Her diamond necklace sparkled under the lights, but her fury made her look small. My daughter, tears streaking her cheeks, tried to speak, but no words came. All she could do was glance at the photo album, her face twisted in sorrow. In that silence, I felt something shift inside me. For years, I'd lived under the weight of her rejection, letting shame gnaw at me. But tonight, I realized, my worth was never theirs to decide. I had given my child love, stability, and memories that wealth could never buy. No ballroom, no family fortune, no diamond ring could erase bedtime stories whispered in the dark, or the nights I stayed awake sewing her dress so she wouldn't feel less than anyone else. I walked toward the table and closed the photo album gently, my fingers brushing the worn cover. This chapter is done, I thought. Those memories were mine, untouchable, sacred, eternal. My daughter gasped softly, as though the sound of that closing book struck her harder than words ever could. She looked at me with desperation, 1,000 apologies caught in her throat. But I didn't need to hear them. Some wounds could not be patched in a single night, not even in the glow of fairy lights and nostalgia. Gasps rose from the crowd as I turned and gathered my things. I didn't scream. I didn't curse. I didn't beg. I simply lifted my head and walked with dignity through the doors of the hall. The confetti crunched beneath my shoes, music still playing behind me, laughter faint but steady. My heart was breaking, yes, but it was also free. Behind me, chaos swirled. The groom's family sputtered, horrified at their unraveling spectacle. The wedding crumbled before their eyes. No amount of money could glue it back together. Guests murmured openly about the cruelty of a daughter denying her mother. For the first time, the shame was no longer mine to carry. As I stepped out into the cool night air, I took a deep breath. The stars above seemed brighter, sharper, as though the universe itself had decided to reward my truth. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Because love, real love, isn't about spectacle. It isn't about status. It's about showing up when no one else will. About sacrifices made in silence. About memories no amount of wealth can purchase. I had given that to my daughter. Whether she chose to accept it was no longer my burden. She may have been broken by regret in that hall, but I refused to let bitterness poison the years I had left. I walked away with grace, carrying not the weight of rejection but the strength of knowing I had loved fully, fiercely, and without condition. The photo album remained behind, glowing softly under the fairy lights, a silent reminder to all who saw it that memory cannot be erased and truth cannot be bought. And as the night closed around me, I whispered to myself, this is not the end. This is simply where my story turns. If you stayed with me until now, then you already know the truth I carried out of that night. Wealth fades, appearances crumble, and even the grandest celebrations can collapse under their own weight. But dignity, your ability to walk away with your head held high, that is priceless. Betrayal cuts deeper than any blade, especially when it comes from the very person you sacrificed everything for. It leaves scars you can't always see. But I learned something standing there with that photo album in my hands. Peace doesn't come from forcing someone to acknowledge you. It comes from knowing you stayed true to yourself, even when others try to erase you. That album, filled with bedtime stories, birthday candles, and dreams once shared, reminded me of what truly matters. Love is not proven by invitations or receptions. It's proven in the quiet, ordinary moments that no one else sees. Those can never be stolen. So I ask you this: have you ever been betrayed by someone you loved most? Did you ever feel erased, overlooked, or cast aside by the very person who should have held you closest? Share your story with me in the comments. I promise you are not alone. And if my story touched you, don't forget to subscribe. Because there are so many voices like mine, mothers, fathers, children, whose stories deserve to be heard. Together, we can make sure no one ever walks through heartbreak in silence.